Throughout American history, the balance of power between the government and its citizens has been a topic of constant debate. From as far back as George Washington's presidency, there have been concerns about the amount of power any given government official can wield. Democratic Republicans were wary of the executive branch entrusting too much power to one person, but it does not take a president to wreak havoc on the nation. This is Fear in America, the scary extent of government overreach from 1945 to 1962 that shaped the American identity.
During 1945 to 1962, many Americans developed the fear of government overreach, which originated from McCarthy's exploitation of government powers and grew due to government decisions such as joining the Korean and Vietnam War. The government's continued abuse of power in this era led many American citizens to question the limit of governmental powers.
Fear of government overreach originated from the ideas of McCarthyism and the beginnings of the Cold War. Joseph McCarthy first started out as a junior senator from Wisconsin. He was anxious to get ahead by any means and did not hold back when it came to manipulating the truth. McCarthy convinced the American people that although he could not list every single communist, he had in his hand a list of 205 communists in the State Department. McCarthy seized this opportunity to paint these alleged traitors as a major threat to America's post World War II grandeur dominance and strike fear into the hearts of Americans. To reassure citizens on the issue of communism, the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, was formed to investigate alleged disloyalty or communist ties. However, the HUAC never clearly defined the eligibility of what an un-American activity was. As a result, many individuals were falsely blacklisted and accused. Due to this, many citizens saw the HUAC as government overreach into people's private lives, as well as an abuse of power. On top of this, a few years into the Cold War, the United States entered the Korean War, tagging it as a police reaction under the United Nations, which was essentially a military operation that took place without a formal declaration of war. This led to the notion that presidents were allowed to engage in military action without the approval of Congress. Simultaneously, an increase in military expansion also occurred, and some citizens believed that such expansion could lead to excessive government control over affairs. In essence, the ideas of McCarthyism and the Cold War contributed to the origins of fear of government overreach.
When the government encroaches on civil liberties, the entire country is harmed at an emotional, social, and political level. Throughout the Red Scare, it was made clear to all Americans that anyone associated with the Communist Party would be persecuted. This led to distrust between friends, family, and coworkers. The US government made it seem as though they were the only friends of the American people. This manipulation eventually became present in the US military, aimed to spark fear of familial ties within the enlisted. A notable example of this fear in familial ties would be the case of Milo Radulovic, an American Reserve Air Force lieutenant whose father was a Yugoslavian immigrant. Hoping to keep up with events going on back home, Radulovic's father subscribed to various Serbian newspapers. These papers were connected back to the American Slav Congress, which had been labeled by the US as communist propaganda. Due to this, in 1953, the United States Air Force attempted to strip Lieutenant Milo Radulovic of his commission for associating with his allegedly subversive father and sister. McCarthy had successfully inserted the American government and its interest into family life. McCarthyism had made it possible to lose jobs and even family because of a newspaper subscription. The hardships Milo Radulovic endured shed light to the social and emotional fear presented before the American people of the time. Additionally, the polarization of the left and the right had one of the largest impacts on the American identity. The news reporter Edward R. Murrow understood this fact and held true to the idea that if the fight against communism became a fight against America's two great political parties, the American people would know that one of those parties will be destroyed. Different ideas balance a republic, but McCarthyism was dividing the country, pitting the left and the right against each other, causing a great imbalance in the democracy. Murrow was hoping to show the American people that fear was pulling them apart, thus pulling the democracy apart. Alongside the fear of losing one's job and family, Americans held the fear of the democracy dismantling itself.
Throughout American history, fear of government corruption influenced the way Americans react to events. Americans, specifically during 1945 to 1962, were already experiencing symptoms of the government's seemingly growing willingness to wield their power to make rash decisions. The Korean War and Vietnam War drafted thousands of Americans to fight when the majority of American citizens did not even support the violence to begin with. Out of the two wars, the Vietnam War received the most backlash from Americans, as Americans criticized the people in power for their unreasonable decisions. This would generate public opposition and large protests at universities across the country. At Harvard University, for example, students organized a national Burn Your Card movement where protesters trapped the former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara in a police car and assailed him with questions about the war. Americans were willing to go really far to advocate for the problems broadcasted on television, since from their point of view, Americans were watching their family, friends, and loved ones get taken away from them to fight in wars they did not believe in. Americans, when presented with any kind of fear, have used activism as a tool to raise their voices, which pushes the democratic process so the government changes to reflect its population's views. For example, during the recent TikTok ban, organizations such as the American Civil Liberties Union outcried that the Supreme Court gave the executive branch unprecedented power to silence speech it did not like. Americans reacted to the fear by weakening the origin behind the problem using activism to protest against the Supreme Court, which eventually pushed politicians like President Trump to bring TikTok back to the general public. Overall, the government between 1945 and 1962 and the government today show signs of intruding into Americans' personal lives, which produces various reactions from Americans based on their understanding of the problem, in order to change policy in the government.
Between 1945 and 1962, many Americans began to fear government overreach, which was sparked by Senator Joseph McCarthy's exploitation of government powers, and later intensified by decisions like the U.S. involvement in the Korean War, Vietnam War, and the attacks on the U.S. Army. Battles within the press and at home brought the fear to the front of the American mind. Some would react by keeping quiet, others would protest and rally, and a select few would take matters into their own hands. Government overreach has plagued America frequently throughout history, so it begs the question if this fear can ever be put to an end.